We're looking into how money, the economy, and prosperity first got started and evolved in ancient times. A good place to start is by checking out how inequality happens and the ways advanced civilizations use different forms of differentiation. Once people want to be more than simple farmers tending their fields, you start seeing a split in society. Some folks end up richer than others, with more privileges, cooler jobs, better working conditions, and nicer living spaces. That's what we call vertical differentiation, basically the upper and lower parts of society. It's seen as a natural side effect of civilization, probably going all the way back to the Neolithic era. As soon as someone invests in their land, while the neighbor doesn't, you get inequality. This trend becomes even clearer when you add in functional differentiation alongside vertical differentiation. That's easy to spot with the rise of cities. Lots of people think a city is just a big settlement with tons of residents, but it's more specific than that. A real city is a place where some folks don't farm the food they eat. One person might farm enough to feed others who don't work the land at all. As soon as certain people can spend their time on other stuff, crafts, writing, priesthood, or soldiering, that's when you've got a real urban society. Well-known sites like those Copper Age settlements in Eastern Europe, which supposedly had thousands of inhabitants, still don't meet that definition. The same goes for Catalhoyuk in Anatolia, and later the Celtic oppida like Manching in Central and Western Europe. They got pretty big, but everyone still basically farmed and supported themselves. What really matters is that a true city has some people who aren't farming at all, focusing on other professions. Then you've got organizers too. If some produce food and others don't, you need an interface. These days, we'd call it a market or some sort of administrative setup. Someone's got to figure out how to connect producers and non-producers. That's where politicians, bureaucrats, and similar roles come in to keep the system running. History, though, doesn't move in a neat straight line. We've got big time periods, the Bronze Age, Classical Antiquity, the Renaissance, and we can see certain high points or golden ages in each. A civilization can exist in different states, so to speak, some offering a better quality of life than others. Some experts even say the late antiquity period and the so-called fall of the Roman Empire weren't real collapses, just big transformations. During that time, fewer goods might have been produced, and overall education took a dip, while spirituality got a boost. Depending on your personal viewpoint, there are eras you'd prefer to live in, and those you'd definitely want to avoid. Take 6th century Italy, where Goths, Byzantines, and all sorts of groups were fighting. Most people probably wouldn't call that their dream era. When you look at the high points of a civilization, it's often those so-called evil empires that act as its bedrock. The stronger those empires get, the better off the people inside them tend to be. Empires like Rome, Akkad, or the Achaemenid Persians talked a lot about their civilizing mission, but you could argue that the folks within those borders generally had it better than people on the outside. Another interesting topic is how the Bronze Age civilizations finally ended. Until a few decades ago, it was pretty common to talk about a huge invasion of sea peoples who supposedly swept and destroyed the New Kingdom of Egypt, Assyria, and the Levantine cities. Then Italian scholars started questioning that single cause explanation, things like earthquakes, tsunamis, iron technology, or drought. Instead, they described a tightly interconnected, almost international system with a few big imperial players and maybe a dozen or two smaller states. We shouldn't compare ancient societies to ours one-to-one. Pre-industrial cultures were way more fragile economically, so little hiccups could blow up into major crises. Chaos theory might help explain it. Lots of coincidences and contingencies all piling up. Like, it could happen, but doesn't have to. Contingency is like the little sister of pure chance, and historians often underrate how big a role it plays. After the Bronze Age world unraveled, it could take a few centuries for societies to stabilize again. The Phoenicians were one of the first groups to bounce back quickly after those big Bronze Age empires fell. They lived along a strategically useful coastal strip in the central Levant, what's now mostly Lebanon, plus parts of Syria and Israel. They had some fertile land, but it was only really enough for smaller cities. At the same time, mountains blocked direct contact with the interior, so the sea was the only real option. That opened up trade routes with Egypt and other Mediterranean zones. letting them absorb and pass on all sorts of cultural influences. Compared to the Bronze Age, the Iron Age had a different kind of economic environment. The Phoenicians lived in small city-states along the coast, which couldn't compete directly with the gigantic Bronze Age empires, though those had all vanished around 1200 BCE. Suddenly, the loss of imperial protection made things riskier and less stable, but it also created brand new opportunities. The Phoenicians took advantage of their cedar resources. Cedar was in high demand because of its long, sturdy trunks, which made it great for building projects and all sorts of items. In Egypt especially, cedar was a popular import, used for things like burial chambers and other construction. Back in the days of the major empires, though, trade was often controlled from above. The Egyptians would show up in Byblos demanding cedars in exchange for the pharaoh's protection. Not exactly a sweet deal for the Phoenicians. But once ancient Egypt went downhill around 1200 BCE, that power dynamic flipped overnight. A fictional text from that era describes an Egyptian envoy trying to negotiate in Byblos. The local king basically shuts him down, insisting on a straightforward payment. No money, no wood. Even if the story might have been written as a scribe's exercise, it still shows how drastically things changed. Egypt was no longer the big shot it used to be, and the Phoenicians knew how to use their new freedom to their advantage. From today's perspective, you could say that the Iron Age gave rise to an early form of market economy or capitalism, plus some initial hints of globalization. By contrast, the late Bronze Age economy was more like a centralized palace system. Big institutions, these palaces, handled the link between surplus from the countryside and city dwellers who didn't farm. They'd collect tribute and then redistribute goods, which kept the economy under control, but also limited people's freedom. Sure, there were still private or market-based activities going on, but they took a back seat to the big institutions in charge. The Phoenicians were trailblazers in a more self-directed kind of economy, paving the way for the Greeks, who picked up a similar playbook a bit later. After the Trojan War and a long slump, the Greeks staged a remarkable comeback around the 8th century BCE. They founded colonies all over the place, from southern Italy and Sicily to the Black Sea, basically to offload their surplus population into more fertile territories. Unlike modern colonialism, these new settlements became independent city-states right from day one. Soon enough, the Greeks, much like the Phoenicians, took on a major role in long-distance trade. Athens became one of the most powerful cities, setting the standards and expanding its networks across much of the Greek world. By the 8th century BCE, the Greeks were heading out onto new seas, exploring lands they hardly knew existed. Plato would later joke that the Mediterranean was just a small pond, with Greeks clustered around it, like frogs on the shore. Early on, this exploration was a total shot in the dark. Nobody really knew what lay beyond, say, Italy. But over time, that mystery world felt more familiar and almost easy to navigate. Trade, economics, and cultural growth all went hand in hand throughout this process. Without a solid economic footing, there's no way Greek cultural achievements could have flourished. Just think about the elaborate tragedies by Aeschylus or Sophocles. Those productions cost a lot of money and could only happen in a wealthy polis like Athens. Athens reaped the benefits of its prime location in a growing trade network, plus the tribute from other city-states in the Delian League. Originally formed as a defensive alliance against Persia, the League soon morphed into a kind of micro-empire, funneling massive resources into Athens. That let the city bankroll theater, arts, and philosophy, all while rising to top dog status in the Aegean. Trading cities. Before Athens, Corinth as a trailblazer. Even before Athens, other polis thrived through trade. Corinth was a key pioneer here. Its spot on the isthmus between the Gulf of Corinth and the Saronic Gulf, where sea routes and overland routes intersect, turned Corinth into a booming commercial center early on. Corinthian pottery in particular was hot stuff, well beyond its hometown. Archaeological finds show how widely it was exported. You can find bits of Corinthian ceramics all around the Mediterranean. In the early days, they often copied the eye-catching designs of other cultures, like metallic effects they'd seen from the Phoenicians. That strategy worked like a charm, and they shipped these pieces all over. From an economic history standpoint, Corinth is fascinating because it paved the way for many things we later see as hallmarks of Athens' rise only 50 to 100 years earlier, the invention of coinage in Lydia. Around 600 BCE, another major innovation came along: coinage. It popped up in Lydia, a smaller kingdom in Western Asia Minor. Lydia lay between the rising Persian Empire on one side and Greek cities on the Ionian coast on the other. It also had plenty of precious metals, perfect for minting coins. People had used precious metals as a trading medium for ages, but it was the Lydian rulers, especially the legendary Croesus, who first thought to pour molten metal into standard shapes and stamp them. That stamp guaranteed purity and weight, meaning you didn't have to keep weighing lumps of metal every time you traded. This innovation worked because all the trade partners bought into the idea that the stamped coin was worth what it claimed to be. Theoretically, any city or people could have minted metal, but you needed the group consensus that these coins had a set value. That payoff, lower transaction costs and more reliable exchanges, was so huge that the practice of coinage spread fast in the 6th century BCE, especially in Greek trading hubs, money, ideas, and cultural growth. During the same period, the Greeks started diving into early forms of systematic natural philosophy. Even today, people debate whether there's a link between the rise of money and the new scientific mindset. British scholar Richard Seaford talks about a possible money-mind connection, which brings to mind the notion of an axial age, coined by Carl Jaspers, when major breakthroughs supposedly popped up in multiple cultures at once. It's totally plausible that technical, economic, and intellectual innovations feed into each other when a civilization is at a turning point. Conclusion. From the Phoenicians in the Lebanon region, who took an early shot at a market-based approach, to Corinth's booming pottery exports, and all the way up to Athens's cultural and political domination, there's a clear thread running through it all. Whenever a city-state culture could rely on thriving trade routes and efficient exchange systems, it gained power and influence. The invention of coinage in Lydia was a huge milestone, supercharging trade and freeing traders from tedious bartering and constant weighing. A prime example is the invention of money and coinage. Just being open to something as abstract as a universal payment medium calls for a certain theoretical or conceptual mindset. You've got to accept that a stamped piece of metal is worth trading for, instead of always relying on an object's direct utility. In that sense, money itself is proof of abstract thinking. That said, we shouldn't expect the ancient Greeks and Romans to have developed full-blown, modern-style economic theories. Sure, people like Aristotle, Xenophon, and others occasionally mulled over trade and exchange, but compared to our modern theories, their approaches seem cautious, sometimes a bit out there. It's more like they were exploring things, asking ethical or philosophical questions without fully cracking them. Centuries later, you can say the same about Karl Marx, whose labor theory of value, tying a product's worth to the hours put into it, overlooks plenty of real-world market mechanisms. Marx and Aristotle both focused on big-picture ideas rather than the nitty-gritty of supply and demand. Still, there could be a money-mind link, like British scholar Richard Seaford suggests. He saw a reciprocal spark between coinage and abstract thought, especially in the 6th and 5th centuries BCE, when Greek natural philosophy was coming together. Seaford also extended that argument to India and intended to do the same for China, which had its own early standardized spade coins. Archaeologists have found evidence that there were minting facilities in China as early as 640 to 550 BCE, nearly the same period Lydia was coining money. You could guess that points to some broader axial age, as Carl Jaspers called it, an era when major cultural, social, and technological leaps happened across different parts of the world at the same time. We shouldn't get carried away with the whole axial age idea, though. Some people think it's pretty hyped up, but it's clear that big cultural regions, like the Eastern Mediterranean, the Indus area, and China, changed a lot during the first millennium BCE, and they may well have been in touch with one another. By the Hellenistic and Roman eras, long-distance trade was definitely on the rise, so it's not crazy to think that earlier periods were already more connected than we used to believe. Trade almost certainly boosts our number sense. Think bookkeeping, math skills, and contracts. That ties in nicely with Max Weber's theory, Weber argued that once techniques for accounting and rational calculation spread across late medieval Europe, it basically set the stage for modern capitalism. If we apply that to ancient times, coin-based economies might have done more than just speed up commerce. They may also have driven more abstract thinking. The more complicated trade gets, the more you need new concepts and theories to manage it, which can then spill over into other areas of life. China adds another piece to the puzzle. If they really developed standardized coinage around the same time Lydia did, that's one heck of a coincidence. Maybe they were both seeing a population boom, expanding trade, rivalry among city-states or local powers, and the desire to streamline taxes and transactions. All those factors together might explain why similar leaps forward happened in different corners of the world around the 6th century BCE. So, you end up with a big picture where trade and intellectual life keep kicking each other up a notch. Once a people starts building broad networks and marketing goods beyond its own backyard, they need math, planning, and organization. The abstract thinking required for that can then fuel new philosophies, belief systems, and cultural expressions. In that light, things like coinage, the emergence of early Greek natural philosophy, and parallel developments in India and China all appear as parts of a bigger wave of innovation in human history. The Renaissance is often touted as a prime example of how economic progress can spark advances in thought. If we apply that idea to the first millennium BCE, then maybe this so-called axial age looks like an early version of those cultural shakeups. If coin money or similarly standardized currencies really did boost abstract thought, we've got to wonder whether certain religious movements of the same period were a backlash against growing commercialization. In the Indus region and in ancient Greece, various groups, Pythagoreans or different ascetics, embraced a life without many material wants, almost like they were protesting rising wealth. You can see something similar in certain Jewish texts, though there's still a ton of debate about the precise dating of those. Aristocratic pushback against the rise of commerce. The rise of new commercial elites in the 6th century BCE set off tensions within the Greek city-states. Some people got really rich through trade, while the old-school landowning aristocracy, shaped by warfare and large estates, looked down on these nouveaux riches who climbed the social ladder through commerce alone. Writers like Theognis of Megara make it clear that traditional nobles despised the upstart merchants. Later philosophers like Plato, Xenophon, and Aristoteles recognized the importance of trade for the city-state, but they often took a wary stance toward the social shifts it caused. Essentially, major changes always spark conservative reactions too. Early forms of money in the Bronze Age. Archaeologist Maulin Lenins de Wilde discovered evidence of Spangen bars, bracelet-like ingots, and spiral rings in Europe that might have been used like Bronze Age money. They often show up bundled in groups of 10, all with similar measurements and weights. This could mean people back then had some form of basic currency system, which made it easier to figure out how much something was worth. So why didn't that system stay around continuously? One idea is that this ingot cash concept fell by the wayside whenever big palace-based or political structures collapsed and smaller-scale barter took over. It wasn't until the 7th and 6th centuries BCE, when bigger states and more extensive trade networks returned, that the invention of stamped coins became a real game changer. The push and pull of trade, math, and religion. If we really see a decimal system in these ingots, it ties into a central issue: how bookkeeping, math, and abstract thinking all connect. That echoes Max Weber's claim that a calculative mentality in economic life paved the way for capitalism. Hints of it might have existed earlier, just not in any permanent form, at least not until coin minting took off in Lydia, Ionia, and possibly China. At the same time, whenever there's a surge in material goods, new trade routes, and expanding global knowledge, you often see pushback, ascetic lifestyles, religious revivals, or criticism of excess. Just like the Renaissance triggered reformist or humanist movements, you could argue that new religious ideas, like Buddhism or certain strands of Judaism, cropped up in the first millennium BCE as reactions to big social transformations. The alphabet, a catalyst for economic growth. Another huge milestone was the adoption of an easy-to-use alphabet, while Egyptian hieroglyphs Mesopotamian cuneiform and Demotic script required specialized scribes. Alphabets let merchants and regular folks handle their own writing for business. No more years of training just to manage orders or contracts. As a result, writing went from a narrow skill set held by a few experts to something the broader society could tap into. Alphabet as an economic booster. Merchants especially cashed in on this development. Business letters, inventory notes, and receipts became a breeze. They could file their own documents without relying on big palaces to do it. Researchers suggest this might have helped chip away at the palace's central role, since locals could start drafting their own deals and running their own trade networks. Early money systems and their disappearance. Why didn't a decimal system or other proto-money ideas like Spangen bars or spiral rings stick around in the Bronze Age? Possibly because those concepts depended on large centralized rule. When those empires fell apart, smaller communities drifted back to barter. Not until the 7th and 6th centuries BCE did stamped coins, in Lydia, the Greek world, and maybe China, become standard and widely accepted. Later on, in medieval Europe, coin usage went through its own ups and downs until it finally became the mainstay of the economy from the late Middle Ages and into the Renaissance. Economic resources fuel intellectual growth. Whether you call it an axial age or not, it's hard to deny that prosperity and economic stability are key ingredients for the rise and spread of knowledge. Look at how much money was poured into artists and scholars during the Renaissance. The same logic applied in ancient times. There had to be enough surplus to support scribes, scholars, or later on philosophers. Without solid financial backing, universities, libraries, and theaters would never have grown to the scale we see in some cultures. Spotlight on pottery. Proto-industrial mass production. A great window into the ancient economy is pottery. From the Bronze Age into Roman times, tableware was produced in ever larger quantities and in increasingly specialized ways. Everyone used pottery, whether it was for daily meals, storing goods, cooking, or having a fancy set for special occasions. Though it breaks easily, it survives well in the ground, giving us big clues about trade routes. Over time, certain centers got so specialized they supplied much of the Mediterranean world and beyond. A famous example is Roman terra sigillata from southern Gaul. This shiny red fineware shows up across Europe, North Africa, and parts of Western Asia, proving that a global market existed way back then, centuries before our own global age. Trade contacts with East Asia. Trade with East Asia, especially China, was also a key part of the ancient economic landscape. Silk, spices, and other luxury items made their way to the Mediterranean pretty early, at least by the Hellenistic era, via the Silk Roads. Plenty of those routes still aren't fully researched, but we see signs of intense exchange. Archaeological finds and written sources suggest that the movement of goods, ideas, and tech was more advanced than once thought. Whether we're talking about user-friendly alphabets or proto-industrial mass production of pottery, whenever economic conditions get stable enough to free up resources for bigger projects, innovation follows, both technical and cultural. This process can spread across vast distances, as shown by the links between the Eastern Mediterranean and China. Again and again we see that an invention, like rudimentary forms of money, can fall into oblivion for a while, only to be rediscovered and elevated to a higher level when new political or economic situations arise. This illustrates just how closely trade, written culture, and intellectual achievements were interconnected in antiquity, and how much they drove each other forward. The Hellenistic period, meaning the era after Alexander the Great, when his empire broke apart into several successor states, in many ways ushered in a global trade system around the Mediterranean. All of a sudden, there were very large kingdoms whose upper classes had considerable financial resources and invested them in prestigious luxury goods. Exotic items like silk, pepper, or saffron became sought-after status symbols. The rediscovery of the monsoon winds toward the end of the 4th and early 3rd centuries BCE also opened up faster sea routes between the Mediterranean world and the Indian Ocean. As a result, new markets emerged in the West, willing to pay high prices for rare imports from India or the Far East. Until then, especially among the Greek city-states, political units had generally been smaller. Their main focus was often on fundamental goods, such as grain, like the grain shipped from the Black Sea region to Athens to feed its population. But now, in these large Hellenistic kingdoms, their rulers were less concerned with merely organizing food supplies. Instead, they created a demand for luxury items and coveted rarities, particularly silk, because a wealthy elite had formed, keen to show off its status with such products. That said, one shouldn't forget that even in the Persian Empire before Alexander, elites enjoyed luxury goods. However, the Persian Empire was territorially so vast that many goods traveled primarily by land along already established routes to major centers. In the Hellenistic period, things changed in that these new kingdoms placed heavy emphasis on maritime trade. They integrated numerous coastal regions and actively promoted seaborne commerce, thus expanding the range of goods and exchanges significantly. Another reason for this upswing was the somewhat more capitalist mindset of the Greek-influenced kingdoms. The earlier great empires of the ancient Near East, like the Persian Empire, relied more on a centralized palace and administrative economy. In contrast, the Greek tradition in the cities already featured robust maritime trade and smaller-scale banking, factors that spread across a much larger area in the Hellenistic era. Following the Hellenistic period, Roman dominance eventually took hold across the entire Mediterranean. Two developments were particularly striking there. One, enormous density of transportation and trade. Rome built a network of roads and sea routes that connected the Mediterranean region with vast parts of Europe, North Africa, and the Near East. Goods that had barely been traded over long distances before, such as grain, garum fish sauce, mass-produced ceramics like terra sigillata or wine, could now be shipped in huge quantities to far-off markets thanks to organized fleets and merchant communities. 2. Mass production and wide distribution. In just a few highly specialized centers, for example in southern Gaul, ceramics, ranging from simple everyday vessels to high-quality terra sigillata, were produced and shipped in large batches. Finds show that these wares reached places as far away as barbarian Germany, North Africa, the Near East, and occasionally even India. A similar pattern held for other products, such as olive oil from Baetica, southern Spain, which was transported in amphorae all the way to the Rhine and into Britain. By combining a vast territorial realm, sophisticated infrastructure, and a large military apparatus that provided security, the Imperium Romanum enabled relatively efficient movement of goods. In at least the empire's core areas, this led to the emergence of a kind of world market that, in turn, motivated traders, producers, and financiers to keep investing and seek out new markets. The Roman economy was characterized by three key aspects. 1. Intensive integration within the empire. The Roman Empire boasted an extensive network of roads, ports, and transport ships linking its provinces. Even bulk goods like grain, terra sigillata, wine, or fish sauce, garum, could travel relatively safely and quickly to remote regions such as Britain or North Africa. These reliable supply chains formed a critical foundation for the empire's prosperity and stability. When they began to falter in the 3rd century CE due to political crises, piracy, and border conflicts, the empire lost one of its key economic pillars. This shift contributed to the transition into late antiquity. 2. Far-reaching global connections. The Imperium Romanum was a magnet for luxury and long-distance trade goods from nearly every corner of the known world at that time. Desirable items arrived from sub-Saharan Africa, ivory, gold, exotic animals, India, spices like pepper and saffron, or China, silk. Meanwhile, raw materials and products from the Roman provinces, like amber from barbarian Germania, flowed outward. Numerous trade routes crossed harsh deserts or politically unstable areas. Places like Palmyra served as hubs for collecting, storing, and taxing transit merchandise. The empire's significant purchasing power and the Roman elite's eagerness to flaunt their status with exotic imports fueled ongoing demand for these global goods. 3. Breakdown of trade networks and the end of unity. Despite its impressive interconnectedness, the Roman Empire wasn't invincible. as the imperial structure faced multiple crises during the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, caused by military defeats, economic downturns, and currency troubles. Regional supply chains fell apart one piece at a time. This disintegration of the Roman internal market actually preceded the political fragmentation in many areas. With trade routes drying up and a stable monetary system collapsing, parts of the empire could no longer be supplied affordably. Regional self-sufficiency became more important, and the empire began to splinter. The transition to late antiquity is thus also an economic historical phenomenon. Once trade no longer thrives, political cohesion inevitably suffers. The variety of ancient economic systems and their interplay with politics, culture, and technology makes it clear that progress rarely follows a straight path. Time and again we see golden ages in which empires expanded their trade routes, established monetary systems, and nurtured learning, only for those achievements to crumble in times of crisis or slip into oblivion until fresh circumstances spurred them on again. Through it all, a constant thread was the dynamic give and take between commerce and intellectual growth, a force that continues to shape great civilizations even now. When we look back, we don't just find fascinating stories about booming metropolises and groundbreaking innovations. We also see warnings about how fragile even the mightiest empire can be once its economic foundations start to shake.